Hi, I'm Bernard. I'm an alcoholic. Okay. We were just talking before the meeting, reminiscing a little bit about my auspicious beginnings as a speaker in Alcoholics Anonymous. And my sponsor set up my first big speaking engagement at a place that was really befitting a man of my stature. It was called the Allen Nest in Reseda. And in case any of you people don't know about the Allen Nest, they empty Camarillo once a year and it ends up in this place. And anyway, I knew about a month in advance that I was going to be the speaker there. So needless to say, within a month I had put together this brilliant, articulate, great pitch. And the day before I was supposed to give this pitch, I get a call from the guy who'd asked me, and he said, you know, Bernard, we're really sorry. The secretary of this meeting got out of jail on parole a month earlier than he was supposed to, and he asked somebody else. And so that was the end of my first big speaking engagement. And they said they'd call me back, but they never did. They didn't even hear me. My next speaking engagement was also set up by my sponsor. It was out in somewhere near a racetrack. I'm not sure exactly where it was. And they had a coffee break in between the speaker and the other stuff that went on. So I ran out to the restroom to go to the restroom before, and I was in such a hurry to get back that I broke my zipper. And I mean, embarrassing, right? And they had a podium like, the lectern was like this, but there was just like one thin thing there, and there wasn't any, and so I was standing for the whole meeting, kind of like, you know, this, and I'm sure I looked really comfortable. But anyway, I'm comfortable being here tonight, and I guess that's kind of amazing from where I come from. What we're taught to talk about is what it's like, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. That's it. And what it was like was that I was born 40 years ago tomorrow in Massachusetts. And I was born into a really nice family. Everybody loved me. I was not one of those kids that felt alienated coming out of the birth canal. I didn't feel like I belonged on another planet. I didn't want to stick a knife in my gut when I was 3 years old. I didn't plan to bump off my 4th grade teacher. I was happy. I had a good time. I was the type of kid that was a star athlete, a top student. I was the type of kid that other parents would point to and say, hey, why can't you be like him? And that has some certain drawbacks to it, to be sure. But the bottom line was I was happy, and I had a good childhood. The first really negative thing that happened in my life was when I was 16 years old, and my father died. And he was really the centerpiece of my life. I loved him with just everything I had as a human being. And he kind of kept the whole family together. He was that type of person. He made everything seem to work. And relatives who didn't get along got along when he was around, that type of a situation. And I was devastated when he died. And, you know, I went through some of the mourning process, as much as a 16-year-old kid can go through the mourning process. But the pain was just so intense. I remember myself saying, boy, this hurts too much. I don't want to love anybody again. They'll just leave me. And that was to be something that would haunt me for a long time in my life, and was a conscious decision I guess I made that really was a very poor one. I went on through school. I graduated at the top of my prep school class, was a star athlete. I got a basketball scholarship to college, and I went down to Washington, D.C., so I didn't have to be too close to my mother, and embarked upon my college career. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't mentioned anything about alcohol or drugs or anything like that. And that's simply because they weren't in my life at all. They weren't in my conscious sphere. I never used them. As a matter of fact, I was so straight I made Pat Boone look like a pimp. I was, you know... It wasn't until my sophomore year in college that I had my first drink. And I remember the night as if it was yesterday. I really do. It was the Interfraternity Council Ball. I was sitting at this big auditorium in Washington, D.C. with all my fraternity brothers and our dates. And for some reason, I'm not sure what, I imagine it was peer pressure, I took a drink. And after that, I took another drink. And something seemed to go on in me. I didn't like the taste of alcohol, but I seemed to become different, and a kind of different that I liked. It was, I was more handsome, I was taller, I was a better dancer, the typical things you hear from people who have this hypersensitivity or allergy to alcohol. And I believe from the very get-go, from the first drink, I had what's described in the book as the physical allergy. alcohol affects me like it doesn't affect other people, other normal drinkers, that is. And I had a good time that night as far as I can remember, but the next thing I knew, it was the next morning, and I woke up in my bed, and I had no idea how I got home, no idea how my contact lenses got out, nothing. It was a total blackout. And I recognized two things right off. I recognized alcohol was fun, but it was also really dangerous. And it was a thin line that I was walking with alcohol, and I recognized that right away. Alcohol could be my friend, or it could cause me a lot of problems. And what I did throughout my college career was I used alcohol only occasionally, primarily in social situations, and I had to keep a real close handle on it, very close handle on it, or else I'd be out of control and literally anything could happen. Despite this allergy to alcohol, I was very successful in college. I got a varsity letter in basketball. I was president of my fraternity. I graduated at the top of my class, and I applied and got accepted to a half dozen medical schools. I decided to stay in Washington, D.C. because that was home. It had become home, and I liked it there. And it was in my second half of my freshman year in medical school that I found something other than alcohol. And this is another day I won't soon forget. The medical school hippie came running up to me in the hospital, and he said, Bernie, you got to come with me. This drug detail man, so you got to get these sleeping pills. And I had no trouble sleeping, and I had no idea why he wanted me to go get sleeping pills. And he said, oh yeah, this Aurora representative, he's going to give us all these free samples. And I really wasn't that interested, but I went along with him because he was a friend. And this guy had this bottle of Quaaludes, and there were 100 of them. And he, was giving out bottles of 100 as samples to the medical students. And I didn't know that, Quaaludes from a hole in the wall. And I took him home, and Gene came over that night, and I said, well, how many do I take? Well, what do you do with these? And he said, how much do you weigh? I said, 190, and I said, oh, 1.5. And okay, so I took 1.5 Quaaludes, and it seemed like the same thing happened with alcohol. In fact, I got this feeling I liked, and the next thing I knew, I woke up the next day with a jelly donut in my mouth. And I had no idea what had happened, and it was really strange. It was really strange. So, that was another piece of material for my armamentarium there of drugs and alcohol. And I think somewhere in there I smoked a little pot. I thought I had everything under control, though, because I didn't use alcohol or Quaaludes or marijuana very often. And when I did, I was very careful how I used it and where I used it and how much I used. But there were some chinks showing up in my armor. There were some periods of loss of control that nearly cost me very dearly in medical school. And two examples are real good ones. One of them was in my junior year, and I was on this obstetrics and gynecology rotation. And yeah, that was a fun rotation. And I was at the university hospital, and this 30-ish Capitol Hill secretary type, erudite, well-spoken, good-looking lady was being admitted to have a hysterectomy the next day for cervical cancer. And the medical student works him up, the resident works him up, and the private physician, that's the way it goes anyway. I went in and I talked to her, I took her history, we had a nice conversation together. You go through an exam, and we talked afterwards. We had this really nice rapport, and I was working at an 11 in the morning to 11 at night shift. And if any of you are familiar with Washington, D.C., catty corner from Washington Circle, from the University Hospital, is a bunch of bars, and that's where the medical students hung out. So at 11 p.m., I went to this bar, and the Red Lion, and I had a glass of wine, and I began to think about my day. Had another glass of wine, and I started to think about this woman. Had a third glass of wine, and, I said to myself, she liked me. She really liked me. I had a fourth glass of wine, and I knew that she found me irresistible. I knew that she found me irresistible. The next thing I knew, I woke up the next morning in a hospital bed with a patient I was supposed to be doing a hysterectomy on that day. And that could have been the end of my medical career, except for one thing. She did find me irresistible. And there was... And where my head was then, you know, I was going around bragging about it, you know. And, you know, as I look back, it was, you know, it was the height of insensitivity to do something like that. But what can you do? There was another episode in my 4th year that was, that could have been equally as destructive. I took an elective in my senior year in medical school in London for 3 months. And then I had a couple months off to travel around Europe, and I did that. And I landed in Amsterdam for about a week. And for those of you who have never been to Amsterdam, it's probably the drug capital of the world. And they have some tremendous Moroccan hash there. And I spent a week on this hippie boat that I was living on, just getting totally wasted on Moroccan hash. And you know, my last day was coming up, and I knew I was going into France the next day, and I knew they were very, very strict in France. When you cross the border, they'd take one look at me, and I'd be in trouble. So we had this big party, and we smoked a lot of hash, drank a lot of alcohol, had a lot of these marijuana brownies. And the next morning, I got up and had some more of the marijuana brownies, but I had no drugs in me when I was going across the border. So I get to the border crossing, I think it was near Strasbourg, and these guards take one look at me, and they say, yeah, little punk, he's going to have something on him. So they went through my luggage, and I had this bag, and they went through all that, and they found nothing. And then the gendarme was kind of cocky, and he went into my knapsack, and he put his hand in like that, and he pulled out this pair of underwear that hadn't been washed in about a month. And he looked at it, and he was repulsed by it, and I started laughing. I just couldn't stop laughing at this guy. And while I was laughing, I lost control of some gas that I had from my rear end. And there were these 2 German shepherds. This is funny. There were these 2 German shepherd drug-sniffing dogs. And about 30 seconds after I started laughing, the ears went up, and they were on me like dirt, boy. They just jumped me. It was unbelievable. And I got taken, you know, I got arrested, you know, because they were sure something was going on, because these drug-sniffing dogs don't... And I got to meet the police proctologist, who was... I got out about a day later from that, and what I was doing was I was saying, oh, those fools, these jerks, I was blaming them, when the reality was I was doing a lot of drugs and alcohol. But see, I was pointing my finger out there, and anyway, I was beginning to lose control, okay? That's pretty obvious. I did a residency in internal medicine in the same university hospital. I decided to stay there. And for the first time in my life, a learning experience was more than I could learn everything easily. I was on call every other night and up almost every other night for the first 6 months. And we were dealing with critically ill people, and there was more than some people could learn in a lifetime. And the pressure began to get to me. And I was living with the woman I was supposedly going to marry from the French Riviera. And what happened was I would come home every night, and I had found a new use for alcohol and Quaaludes. I had gone from using it in social encounters to just getting home and wanting to numb out the pain. And every night that I wasn't in the hospital, I'd come home and just want to numb out the pressure, because I was really feeling overwhelmed. And certainly I wouldn't have admitted it back then, but as I look back, it was an overwhelming experience, because I was used to being able to learn everything. And I couldn't even learn 50% of everything that was put in front of me, and that made me feel inadequate. After about 1.5 years of this, at some level in my gut, I knew something was wrong. And what came out of my mouth is what was going on was what I recognize today as my first geographic. I said, hey, I'm 26 years old. I got to support my mother. I've been in school all my life. It's time for me to go out and open up my practice. So at 26, I came out to California, God knows why, and I put up my shingle in El Segundo. And I had all the medical skills necessary to be a good physician. I was well trained. But my emotional skills had begun to deteriorate. And the next thing my head told me was that I worked very hard. I should have a good time out in California. And what that meant to me at that time was a lot of alcohol, a lot of quaaludes, a lot of cocaine, a lot of marijuana, a lot of women, a lot of partying, and a real crappy medical practice. But it didn't matter, because I was having a good time. I thought that I deserved this, that I should have all this fun because I had done all this. And I recognized that as my disease talking to me. You know, it's an excuse to get loaded. After about 2, 3, or 4 years of that, though, the party was really over, although I wasn't willing to admit that I wasn't having a great time. When I hit 30, I had started to be spending most of my nights at home by myself, getting loaded. And the last year of my drinking was basically all by myself. And I can describe the last year of my drinking very clearly, because every day was the same. I would get up in the morning and I'd feel as if I hadn't slept at all. I'd be tired. I'd have this knot in my gut, afraid to go in my office, and couldn't figure out why. I'd take a shower and I'd still feel dirty. And I'd go into my office because I was a functioning drunk, and I'd be seeing maybe 30 or 40 patients a day. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And that's a shame for somebody who trained 10 years to be a physician and then to hate it. But you know, it's really hard to care about somebody else when you're self-obsessed. And by this time, I was totally self-obsessed. I was only concerned about why I didn't feel better, when was this hole in my gut going to go away, when could I leave? And what I would do is I would take Valium during the day to prevent, I look back at it now, it's preventing withdrawal symptoms. But, you know, I thought it was just because I was under a lot of stress, so that's why I took Valium during the day. And, you know, a good day for me was when I got out early. There was no satisfaction like I get today from working with people and being able to add something to society. And I'd get home every night, and I'd get out my fifth of vodka, because that's what I was drinking every night in my last year. And I'd turn on the TV, and I'd have these tremendous, tremendous mood swings, these tremendous ups and downs. One minute I'd be laughing and fantasizing that I was going to open up the Bass Memorial Clinic in Tahiti, or how I was going to be chief of medicine at Mass General Hospital, right? And the next minute I was uncontrollably crying, and I had no idea why. And I'd go to sleep or pass out and whatever it was, and about every 2 hours I would wake up, and I would wake up in utter panic and terror, sure that there was something in there that was going to get me in my house. This total paranoia about me. And you might think that after going through that for about a year, that I might have considered stopping drinking. But you see, denial is an intrinsic part of the disease of alcoholism. It's a disease that tells you that the alcohol isn't the problem. And I really thought that alcohol was the only thing that was making life decent at all. You know, it was the only relaxation I had. So how could I give that up? And I had been introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous in 1978 by a drunk drivers program, and, you know, I'd gone to their lectures, I'd been sentenced to A, and I went, and I thought it was okay, it just didn't apply to me. And then one night, I was sitting at home doing my regular thing, drinking, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in jail. And I had no idea how I got there, and the first thing that I thought was, boy, I'm not even safe at home anymore. You know? That's a scary thought, you know? That's a real scary thought. I had to figure out where I was going to hide my car keys. And I'd gotten arrested for drunk driving for the 4th time. And I got home, and the next thing I knew, I woke up a day and a half later. And when I woke up stone cold sober. And my office had been trying to get me, the hospitals that I go to were trying to get me. And I was amazed. I just didn't know what happened. I just couldn't explain that day and a half. And I went looking around my house trying to figure out what was going on. And I came upon this empty bottle of pills that I had, and they were Ativan. Ativan is a Valium-like drug. And I had apparently taken a near lethal dose of it. Now, I don't remember trying to kill myself. Maybe I just wanted to, I don't know. I don't have any idea. But when I looked at that bottle of Valium, a chill went up my spine like I had never felt in my life. And I had what's called a moment of clarity in these rooms, and I realized that I just felt that now, you know that? I really did. I knew that what I had heard in these rooms and in that drunk driving program applied to me. And when I felt that, a weight, this tremendous weight, just went off my shoulders. And I went into Alcoholics Anonymous, and June 1st, 1980 is my sobriety date. I'm smiling because when I went into it, it was really a honeymoon. The first 6 months of my sobriety were really something. People had not been interested in me for quite a while. And to have people come to you and befriend you, and it was really a neat experience. There were certainly large issues in my life that needed to be addressed, but I was either unwilling or incapable of addressing them. For the new people here tonight, I'd just like to mention something about bottoms. Bottoms are really an individual thing. To some people who knew me, they would say that probably I would have a high bottom. And I used that bottom that I had as an excuse. I had a lot of external things when I got here. I had a 6-figure income, a couple of expensive sports cars, a real expensive house, and I was very successful on the outside. But see, in here, I was that paranoid, manic, depressive, totally helpless person that I described. And that's all it really takes to come into Alcoholics Anonymous. You hear, kiddingly, I'm sure, that, you know, if you have a watch, you don't belong here. And that just isn't the case. Anyway, getting back to sobriety, at about 6 months, I started to wake up to what was going on around me. And the first thing I woke up to was the fact that my sponsor and his girlfriend and other people were saying, "Bernard, we love you." And I wanted to say to them that I loved them. But if I had said that, it wouldn't have been true, because I was incapable of loving anybody else. I was still the self-obsessed person that walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for some reason, at 6 months of sobriety, that bothered me, that I wasn't able to love other people. And when I run into problems like that, I start asking around, and how do you love somebody else? You know, that sounds like a pretty elementary question, doesn't it? It's one I had never addressed in my life. And I started reading the AA literature, as Bill sees it's a good book for that, the big book, the 12 and 12. And I got all this conflicting information. You know, you speak to one person, they say, well, you have to love yourself first before you're going to love somebody else. And then if somebody else would say to me, well, go out and love other people, then you'll be able to love yourself. So naturally, I tried everything. And what I did was I would go out into my office, and I would go to my most hated employee, the one I was going to fire every minute, every day for as long as she was there. And I'd ask her, how are you this morning? Do you have any suggestions of how we could run this office better? Is there anything I could do to make your job easier? Starting to take some loving action toward other people. And I didn't mean it, I didn't believe it, but I just started doing it. And I started doing this in all areas of my life, you know. And it was interesting. The other thing I did was I started trying to figure out how to love myself, because I figured if I go at it from both ends, maybe I'll have some success. And I figured out if I was going to love myself, I'd better find out who I am. And that was a scary proposition, because for about the last 3 or 4 years of my drinking, I had this disconnected feeling from my body. I felt that I was standing up here and watching somebody live my life for me. And the reason for that was that I had this judgment center in my head. And this judgment center would say, well, if it's Saturday night and you're doing this, you're happy. Or if you're making money doing this, this is good. But see, what that doesn't take into account is how I actually felt, you know? And what I had to do, and this is really rudimentary behavioral skills, which I needed to really get back into, was that if I was sitting someplace having a conversation, I had to say, am I enjoying this? Do I like this? Do I believe in this? Do I not believe in this? And after doing that for a while, and it took quite a while to break this judgment pattern that I had in my head, I began to get some feelings of self-love and feelings of love for other people. And this is going to tie in. It may sound like rambling, but it's going to tie in. By the end of my first year, I was able to love another human being, and it was my first sponsor. His name is Maury Silber, and he was a tremendous man. I didn't think anybody who was Jewish could be an alcoholic, and he was sober 32 years, and I'm Jewish. So that kind of was an important thing for me to see. And he, you know, would take me places, introduce me to people. He was sort of like a second father to me. And he was supposed to give me my first AA birthday cake. And 1 week before my first AA birthday, Maury died. And I was devastated. I was devastated. You know, here I am trying to love people again, and look what happens. You know, look what happens. And I started to withdraw. But because of the training I had in this program, I just sat there at meetings and allowed myself to feel the feelings. And what came up was really astounding for me. What I was feeling underneath most everything else was this tremendous, tremendous anger at Maury for leaving me. And also I had this irrational guilt for not somehow saving him. And when I looked a little deeper, those are the exact feelings that I had never worked through with my father's death back when I was 16 years old. So through the grace of this program, I not only was able to work through and resolve my feelings about the death of Maury, but also of my father. And I was able to go out into the world and love again, which has been a tremendous gift to me, because I spent a lot of years out there unfeeling in that area. And today I think love is what this life is about. So you don't find a lot of places in the world, certainly not in the nightclubs or the bars, where you're going to get a second chance at life like this. And it makes me a little teary when I think about it. I haven't thought about this for a while. Anyway, shortly after learning about love, I learned a lot about some opposite emotions, those of anger and hate. And how it evolved was that a woman was sent to my office. I do a lot of detox work. I'm the chairman of a chemical dependency unit now, and I put a lot of people through detox, and they go through a program which serves as a bridge to Alcoholics Anonymous. And back then, I had about 1.5 years sobriety. This woman was sent to me by some members of my home group, the Radford Street group in North Hollywood. And allegedly this woman wanted to get sober. So she came into my office, and I laid out this kit of spiritual tools for her, how we detoxify, the whole shot. And she said, "Oh, that's great, but what I really want is some Valium and some sleeping pills." And I kind of chuckled to myself, and I said, "Oh, but you don't understand, but this is how you do it." And she said, "No, you don't understand. I want Valium and sleeping pills and blah, blah, blah." So we went back and forth with this and ended up getting into an argument over it. And she started yelling at me and ran out of my office, and I just, no-charged her and just put her in my past, I thought. But a week later, I got a call from the Board of Medical Quality Assurance, which is the governing board and licenses doctors in this state. And she went to them and told them I was under the influence at my office. And what they had on file for me was some drunk driving arrest, which was certainly my fault and had nothing to do with her. But, when they saw the drunk driving arrest and when they saw this complaint, I had to go through a full investigation with them. And I was quickly exonerated of anything, but I had this tremendous, tremendous anger at this woman and an obsession. And what I would think about day and night was how I was going to burn down her house, and how I was going to hire somebody to break her knees, She weighed about 60 pounds, and I was going to hire somebody to break her knees. And then one day my offices are in Burbank, and one day I was walking down Main Street in Burbank, and she was walking the other way, and I was getting ready to stare her down, And she walked by, she didn't even know who I was, She didn't even know I was alive. And she was just going about her own thing, and this began to bother me, I said, I'm going nuts with this. What's going on? What's this anger business with me? And what I did was I went around to my buddies in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had another sponsor by then with many years of sobriety, and I said, why am I angry like this? And he referred me to a number of books in Alcoholics Anonymous literature, and he talked to me about it, and I talked to other people. And what came out of my little search was this type of anger that I was experiencing was based in fear. And this type of fear I was experiencing was based in a lack of faith. And what I was forced to do at this time was look at the issue of faith in my life, and that is an issue I had never addressed. Never addressed. I had thought about it for a minute on a few occasions, but faith wasn't something I would think about. It just isn't something that comes up in your daily living for me back then. And what I had to do was look at some facts in my life, reasons why I should have faith. I did a lot of drinking and a lot of drugs, and I can see, I can smell, I can feel, I can hear. I was exonerated from that lady's charges. I'd driven drunk numerous times. I hadn't killed myself or anybody else. And, you know, I had good reason to have faith. And when I looked at that issue honestly, what happened was this anger toward this woman just dissipated. And I look at that as me taking the second step of Alcoholics Anonymous. See, I was insanely angry at this woman. And of my own power, nothing was going to change. But see, there is a power greater than myself that can restore me to sanity. And what happened was, I became willing to allow that to happen by letting faith into my life. And in fact, most of the major things that have gone on in my sobriety have to do with the steps. And just about everything I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be connected to the steps, because that's just the way things have worked out for me. I don't take steps. Life throws me curveballs and I become willing. That's what happens. And the next major event in my sobriety was right after my second AA birthday. I planned this trip to a medical convention in Cannes, France, and I'd been there 4 or 5 times with this lady I was engaged to. And I've been to Europe many times prior to that. Traveling is one of my big hobbies, and I've been all over the world. And I'd never been there sober. And so about 2 weeks before this big trip, I started thinking some really interesting thoughts. What happens if I get depressed over there? What happens if I get lonely over there? What happens if I don't have anybody to call? What if they don't speak my language at the meetings? What's going to happen to me? And I was really rolling with this. I mean, I really got into it. And I cornered my sponsor, and I took him to dinner after a meeting, and I laid this out for him in about a half-hour thing, you know, how all this stuff was going on and how I can control this and do that. And at the end of this, I was expecting some esoteric E=mc² type of answer, right? And he gets, you know, he takes out $5, throws it on the table, burps, and looks at me and says, "Bernard, it sounds like you're trying to take the third step," and walks out, right? And so I said, how can he talk to me like that? Doesn't he know I've taken that step? What the hell's he talking about? Needless to say, I didn't hear what he said. And a few nights later, I was walking down in Main Street, Santa Monica, and I went down there for supper. And I was looking in the restaurants, looking in the bookstores, in the nightclubs, in the grocery stores, and this feeling came over me. And it is a feeling that I've had many times before, but never at this level that I'm going to tell you about in a second. And it started with a tremendous, tremendous tiredness, and my body just felt like caving in. I felt just like I could barely walk. And I was running, and I still do run like about 30 miles a week. And I couldn't, you know, I just couldn't move, you know, I was just... And this tremendous feeling of alienation took over my body. And it felt like, oh, crap, when am I ever going to belong on this earth? When am I going to belong with those people in those restaurants and those stores? I don't feel connected to this at all. You know, I'm 2 years sober. What's going on here? And I was really desperate because, you know, my trip was coming up and this was happening now. And I said, oh, crap. And I started thinking about what the hell is going to save me. So I said, well, maybe if I got married and have kids, that would fix me. And while there's nothing the matter with that, I'd had plenty of relationships and they'd never fix me. And then I thought, well, maybe if I returned to Temple, that would fix me. And there's nothing the matter with that. But it never did it for me. And then I began to think about the third step. And I got back into my car, and I went home, and I opened up the big book, which, by the way, I hadn't opened up for a few weeks. And I just opened it up, and it just randomly opened up to the page in chapter 5 that comes after the ABCs, it says, having been convinced of these things, you are ready to take the third step. And normally, if you want to, prove something to me, I have to have a controlled prospective study of it. And, that's how I learn things. But I knew then that there was something that was trying to get my attention. And I knew that this was time for the third step. So because of that discomfort that I was feeling in Main Street in Santa Monica and other places, I was able to take the third step at a level of serenity and surrender that was just really tremendous. It was like being on another honeymoon period. And I went off to Europe, and I got to be the main speaker at a meeting in Florence, Italy. I got to have my own interpreter on a meeting on the French Riviera. I got to do a 12-step call on a guy on the French Riviera, and I got to come up to him and say, "Hi, I'm Bernard, and I've come from Los Angeles to get you sober." And I don't know what happened to him, but his eyes kind of bugged out. And, you know, I got back, and, you know, serenity is really nice, but, you know, I was a guy who was used to running on some adrenaline, so it wasn't long before I was taking back some of that towel I had thrown in. And then it wasn't long after that I was surrendered again by my own actions and my own attitudes. And really my whole third year of sobriety was basically a process of the third step. And on some days I take the whole towel back even now, that's for sure. And but the third step has probably been, besides the first step, the most important part of my sobriety. Because being a physician, I'm used to being in control. I'm used to being the boss. And the reality of the situation is, in life, I'm lucky to be breathing in and out. The next thing that came up in my sobriety was probably right after my third AA birthday. And I went up on a trip. I had a 4-day weekend. I drove up the coast route past here up north. And on this trip, I met this woman. And in this weekend, we went from this tremendous infatuation with each other and like being in love to, by the end of the weekend, probably not going to see each other again, you know? It was a strange experience, but it was one I wouldn't have given up, from what I'll tell you a little bit about later. And the emotional roller coaster that I went through kind of carried over when I was driving home. And as I was driving home, these feelings started coming up. And these are feelings, once again, that I've had my whole life. But I was never able or willing or whatever to feel them. And what came up was tremendous, tremendous feelings of loneliness. And tremendous, tremendous feelings of neediness. You know, and I was saying to myself, why can't I make a relationship work? Why is it like this? And I just started to cry. I just couldn't stop crying, and I had to pull off the road for an hour. It was that out of control. And I drove home, and the pain wasn't going away, so I knew it was time to put the pencil to the paper. And I loathed putting the pencil to the paper. And what came up really surprised me, because my way of looking at life was the reason I was needy and lonely was you. You don't understand me. I'm misunderstood. But when I did that inventory, what came out loud and clear was the reason I was lonely was because of selfishness and self-centeredness on my own part. Big surprise, right? Big surprise, but that's what it turned out. It was a big surprise to me. And I was really devastated by that, but it was important that I learned the truth. It was important that I met that woman last weekend. I guess maybe she was put in my life so I could feel those feelings and get at the truth for me. And what I found out when I looked a little further, to break that selfishness and self-centeredness, I was going to have to find self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. And the only place that I find self-acceptance and self-forgiveness is in rooms like this, is in working the spiritual program of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's it. You know? There is no, you know, I'd like to have a little formula that I could plug myself into, that, you know, 1 + 1 = 2, because I'm a very, very concrete thinker, and it served me well in a lot of areas of my life. But in some areas it doesn't serve you at all. So this spiritual way of life has given me that self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. And for the most part, most of the neediness and the loneliness is gone. There are empty places in my life, but I feel good about me and I accept me. And that's what's really important, and that's what that step gave me more than anything else. And it took me 3 years, over 3 years, to do the fourth step. My sponsor, it took him, I guess, 7 years. And I don't know that I have any great words of wisdom for anybody else, but it worked well for me, doing it that way. The next thing that came up in my sobriety involves the 6 and 7 steps of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had a little more than 4 years of sobriety when this was going on. And what I noticed was that I was having a lot of friction in my life. There was a lot of anger and there was a lot of unhappy interchanges between people, and it primarily showed up in the work area. And it primarily showed up with the consultants that I would work with. And there are a lot of examples of this, but I can probably give you one that'd be really clear. I had admitted this patient to the hospital who had a collapsed lung, and I did my thing with this guy, and he'd been a patient of mine for a long time, and I called in this thoracic surgeon, and what he had to do was stick a tube and suck out the lung and keep it inflated. And, you know, I had written my orders, and then he came in afterwards and written some contradictory orders to what I'd written. I came in the next morning, and the guy said to me, "I don't like this pain shot that this guy's ordering. Can I have the one you ordered?" So I crossed out this guy's orders and wrote my own orders. Needless to say, he came back and he did his thing. So when I saw what was going on, I immediately arched my back at this guy and took this attitude that I was having in all areas of my work life. And this attitude sounded like this: "This is my patient. I am the captain of this ship. You're getting a break making money off of my patients with me letting you do it." So needless to say, with that type of an attitude, I wasn't going to get along too well with everybody. And what was showing up was my number one, my absolute number one character defect, and that's pride. I don't know about anybody else. Certainly other people have other things. But for me, pride is number one. I'm not big on sloth. I'm not big on gluttony. Pride, I'm humongous in. Just humongous. And the 6th step of our program says, became entirely willing to have God remove these defects of character. And I became entirely willing by entirely wearing out my pride, by getting into so many situations with the emergency, you know, getting a call from the administrator of a hospital saying, "Would you please not yell at our emergency room nurses, they're hard to get." You know, that is a way of getting in problems with pride, you know, and it was just really interfering with my life. So I became entirely ready by just wearing it out. I wore it out so much that I was willing to humbly ask him to remove my shortcomings. But I had to do more than that, because my pride doesn't disappear. I had to take some certain actions. I had to act without pride in situations that would come up. And I have many times tried to think myself into better attitudes and actions. What I have found very effectively in this program is I just do it. I just take the action, and eventually, if you see the benefits of the action, it becomes part of your life. So what happened was I started acting without pride to other people, and it felt good. I started using some humility skills that I may have buried someplace, and it felt good, and my life seemed to prosper. And what flowed out of that, taking of the 6th and 7th step, is the concept of spirituality that I use today. And that is probably the most important thing I have going for me as a human being, because it works in all areas of my life. Relationship areas, work areas, just everything. And this concept is this: if I go out on a daily basis and see what I can do for the world, what I can add to the world, as opposed to what I can take from it, it seems to fill me up. If I can go out today and become the best person that I can be, that works for me. It seems to make my life full. I got this message very early on from my first sponsor. I sat him down one day and I laid out all these problems I was having, and I was ready for this deep answer to come back at me. And he said, "Bernard, I want you to go out today and do something for somebody else, and don't let anybody else know." And I was flabbergasted in early sobriety. I said, "Well, how's that going to help me?" But see, spiritual principles have helped me, even though there's some things that I don't understand about them and will never understand about them. It has been an impossible journey from the man who was sitting on that couch, manic depressive, paranoid, depressed, to the person I have become today in any other terms but spiritual terms. I couldn't have done anything else in any other way to get where I am now except through spiritual terms. And for the new people out here, it doesn't, you know, my concept of it is nothing really very deep or Mystical is just simply seeing what you can add to the world on a daily basis. And you don't have to be anything at all to try to do that. You don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to be a spiritual giant. You don't have to be anything but you. Because I believe that God is in all of us and that you have that capability. And I was with all these people, many of them that I had seen before I even got sober. And the feelings that I had inside at being named president of this group was just tremendous. You know, in my good days before I got to this program, I knew a lot about pleasure. I knew a lot about having pleasurable things in my life, but I knew very little about happiness. The types of things that I find happiness in are spiritual things, and there was no spirituality in my life. The fullness and the happiness that I felt from that, I can't put it into words. It was just a tremendous experience. And certain areas of my life are not going so well right now. And, but it just overshadowed everything. And it was just an incredible experience. It's been a very interesting path. I guess I want to close on what my last year has been like in sobriety. Probably my fifth and sixth years of sobriety were basically very smooth, and I had gotten some good spiritual principles, and my life was working very well. My career is incredible. I haven't been in any better physical condition since I played college basketball. Emotionally, I felt good, but there was one big gap, and that was in the relationship area. I dated a lot in sobriety, but for some reason, I didn't get really involved in any relationships. And about a year ago now, I started to date this woman in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I had never dated a woman in Alcoholics Anonymous, so it was all new for me. I was kind of on the outside with my social life, and I guess I liked that separation. And this was not of my doing. You know, I got introduced to her through her brother, who's a pre-medical student. I sponsor him, and it just was, you know, normally I figured that I'm going to go and grab somebody and pick somebody, and, you know, that's the way it would be. And that's the way I always operated, right? And that never worked. So when this happened, I figured, hey, this must be right. And we got along tremendously well. But see, my head was telling me some things. It was telling me, Bernard, you're nearly 40. It's time for you to get married, and it's time for you to have kids, and this is going to be the woman. And so when you have that agenda going on in your head, that causes some problems in relationships. I had this other thing going on with me. You know, I was very good to this woman, and some of that goodness was great because it was just from the heart. But some of it was control. And I wanted to control this lady. So when you put control and your own agenda as opposed to love into a situation, the results you're going to get are going to be unloving. And I'm at a point now in this relationship where it's definitely a day at a time. You know, I like being in control, and the more I want to be in control, the more she runs away. And it's, you know, it's an interesting experience. And, you know, I'm learning things today. I'm learning things today that I probably should have learned when I was 20 years old. But it's certainly interesting. I want to close with a quick story. In this National Council of Alcoholism, where I ran these groups for a long time, there was a man who came in from, I guess he escaped after World War II from Poland. And he'd come to this country, and he was in this drunk driving group. And, you know, I knew the guy's story. And, you know, one day we were lacking for conversation, so I asked him, you know, it must have been very difficult for you to leave Poland, all your family, your friends, your job, your country. And he said, oh, no, it wasn't hard to leave Poland at all. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, the most important thing in a man's life is his freedom. And I just shot back at him. Sounds like you switched from communism to alcoholism. And that was probably a fairly insensitive thing to say to him as I look back on it. And what happened to this man was he looked at me for about 10 seconds, and then he started to cry, and he couldn't stop crying. And for that man, I guess that was his moment of clarity. And, you know, I don't take any credit for that. You know, I just happened to be the conduit when he was ready to hear it. And that man is sober today. I ran into him. And if you're new, I think the issue of freedom might be a big issue for you. You know, do I have to go to these meetings? How long am I going to do this? How long am I going to have to, what do I have to do? Do I have to give up my old friends? It's been my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous that for the alcoholic, the freedom is right here. Alcoholics Anonymous has freed me to become the person I was destined to become before alcohol, drugs, and self got in the way. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. I have been all over the world sober in this program. I've been to meetings all over the world. And the way I was going, the only place I would have seen when I left my couch was the cemetery, because that was about it. I'd like to thank you people for listening to me. Maybe I'll see you guys down in Los Angeles. Have a good one.